Here it is, guys. Week 3 of God Can Make a Way. It's taken by our very own Mark Pomeroy. Grab a notepad and pen because there's plenty of gold in there.
Well, hey there, Elevate friends and family. Great to have you with us today for the third and final week of a series we've called God Can Make a Way. And we launched this 2 weeks ago talking about the reality that God can make a way through fear. And we looked at a guy named Gideon and his story of God taking him from someone who was literally living under this whole kind of weight of fear to ultimately being used by God to defeat an enemy called the Midianites that they'd actually been oppressed for 7 whole years. So that was a very helpful message. Last week, we looked at the reality that God can make a way through obstacles. And in this case, we looked at a slice of Joshua's life. Joshua was leading the nation of Israel towards the promised land, and they literally came up against a wall, and God made a way through that obstacle in a way that only God can. So listen, if you missed either of those, you can either go back and watch them on this platform, or you can listen to those messages on our podcast. Just search Elevate Church Perth on your favorite podcast app, and we'll be there. And in fact, pretty important because today, essentially, whilst it's a third message in this series, is kind of part 2 of last week's message, God Can Make a Way Through Obstacles. Today, I want to talk about the reality that God can make a way through hard times. So, imagine you're lying in bed and having a nice sleep, and suddenly you're woken by some sounds and that are inside your home, and you're thinking, "Ooh, this can't be good. Sounds like maybe an intruder." Then you hear doors and drawers opening and closing. You start to hear voices. You're like, "Oh, more than one intruder." Hopefully, when this happens, it's a hypothetical, I hope. You don't just roll over and go back to sleep pretending that nothing's wrong. No, hopefully, well, maybe you decide you're going to get out there and go like full Chuck Norris on them. Or better still, you're kind of grateful you sleep with your phone within reach of your bed and you call the police. Well, look, this is kind of a metaphor for life. You know, we can be going through a season of life that's easy, peaceful, restful, calm waters. And then sometimes without any warning and without any doing on our behalf, something difficult and something unexpected can come into our life. And, you know, look, one option we have to acknowledge is just to live with it. You know, to settle for something that's less than God's best, but, you know, I'll cope, I'll manage, I'll just keep slogging through this. And for some people, particularly when you're very overwhelmed by a situation and you can't see a way past it or a way out of it, this can seem like the only option, living with it. But I want to put it to you that it's actually when you feel like you don't have any other options but to cope, to settle. This is when you need a breakthrough. You know, your marriage is going great. You're on the same team. And then all of a sudden you find yourselves arguing and disagreeing all the time. You're like, I don't really want to settle for this, but I can't see a way out of this, past this. Well, you need a breakthrough. You know, maybe that job that started out feeling like your dream job, something shifted. And now it's like you want to get out of there, and you've been applying and applying and applying and nothing, no bites, no nibbles, no interviews, nothing. Well, you need a breakthrough. Maybe your tendency to worry about things has now kind of escalated to full-blown anxiety, and you're finding that you kind of can't even function some days. And you feel underwater. Well, you need a breakthrough. And this is the big idea today, that God can make a way through the hard times because he is the God of the breakthrough. So if you've got your smartphone, how about you scan this flow code? It's going to take you to 2 Samuel chapter 5. While you're doing that, let me just give you some context. The main character today is a guy named David. And yes, it's David as in David versus Goliath David. It's David that ultimately became the king of Israel, David. And as we go through this slice of David's life, we're going to arrive at a point in the Bible, which is the only point in the entire Bible that the word breakthrough is used. I don't know if you find that surprising. And in fact, it's actually used in the context to describe something of the nature and character and functioning of God, that he is the Lord of the breakthrough. So let's drop into this slice of history. When the Philistines, who had been the mortal enemies of the nation of Israel, heard that David had been anointed king of Israel, they mobilized all their forces to capture him. But David was told they were coming, so he went into the stronghold. You know, with certain situations and setups in our life comes pressure. You know, being someone's spouse, well, there's some pressure. I mean, good pressure, because you want to be a great spouse, but look, it's still pressure. Being a good boss or a good employee, well, comes inherently with some pressure. Being a good friend can come with some pressure. Now, in these situations, pressure is a privilege. It's a privilege that you've got a spouse. It's a privilege that you've got a job. It's a privilege that you've got some friends, and the pressure that comes with that, sure, it's a pressure. But in this case, we now see that David has leveled up to a new position. And one of the realities of that is that with new positions, new levels, comes new pressure. And if you've been a new parent, you know this, new pressure. If you've got a new promotion, you know this, new pressure. Well, look, the reality, though, is that when we're living for God's purposes, we are going to be attacked. Yeah, I know. It's not good news, but it's the truth, people. And I've got to tell you that. And it's true because we have a spiritual enemy who will mobilize his forces to prevent us from doing the things that God's called us to do, to keep us from making a difference, to distract us, to discourage us. He will come against us. But in these situations, pressure is a privilege because God has chosen you to do something to make a difference through your life. Now, Israel had a long and bitter history with the Philistines, but in this particular moment in history, or the lead up to this moment, David had actually had a kind of a pseudo-friendly relationship with the Philistines, which might sound a little bit odd, but the context was that David was not yet the king. The king of Israel was Saul, and Saul knew that David was coming up through the ranks, so to speak, and felt David was a threat to him. So he put a bounty on David's head, and David went into hiding and actually hid out in enemy territory, kind of like a safe place because he knew that Saul wouldn't come there. David hid out in the Philistines' territory. And they didn't really have anything against David, so they allowed it. But they really had something against Saul, and they really had something against the nation of Israel. And so David was kind of granted safe haven, bit of this idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But now the landscape's changed because now David has been anointed king of Israel. So he's now the kind of heir apparent of the enemies of the Philistines. So now, no more safe haven. In fact, they were coming for him. And chances are some of you have experienced this dynamic. Maybe you started to experience some new success in your business, in your job, maybe some financial breakthrough, and some friends started criticizing you, normally to make themselves feel better and to kind of, it's dysfunctional. It's not good. But friends sometimes do this. Maybe you've got some people in your life, you've been making some great strides to get out of and break free from destructive behaviors. And yet some of the people that you knew in that kind of former life and some of the enablers there, they kind of want to draw you back in. Maybe you're growing in your relationship with Jesus and some of the people around you are like, oh, you're too full on. And you've changed. We liked you before. You're not fun anymore, which following Jesus doesn't mean you have to stop being fun. But look, again, with new positions comes new pressure. And so Samuel records in this slice of history that David, when he heard the Philistines were coming for him, he went into the stronghold. Now, literally for him, that would have been a physical place, like a refuge or a fortress. And he would have gone there just to briefly escape from the pressure. We likely don't have a physical stronghold, a fortress, kind of something that kings used to have. But I want to put it to you today that we actually have something, or more specifically, someone who's even better. Because in fact, God is repeatedly, as you read through his word, described as a stronghold, a fortress, a refuge, a shelter. And we're encouraged to run to him. And we can kind of do this when we sit down and open up his word for 5 minutes or 10 minutes and pray to him. And that's us positioning ourselves like in a stronghold, in his stronghold, to give us some temporary relief from pressure. But the even greater news is that God reminds us, and he will reveal to us that the stronghold isn't like a place. The stronghold is a person, and that we have access to that stronghold, to that refuge, to that fortress every single minute of the day, wherever we are. When that family member starts kind of stressing you out and laying the guilt trip on you, and you feel your anxiety levels rising up, you can actually reach out to God, who is your refuge, your stronghold. David ultimately, and this is like, check this, we can actually get to a place where we can declare this just like David declared this. He alone is my refuge, my place of safety. This is the guy who had a physical stronghold, but he's saying, look, even better than a physical stronghold, God is my refuge, my place of safety. He is my God, and I trust in him. Okay, so let's keep moving through this slice of history. The Philistines arrived and spread out across the valley of Rephaim. And so David asked the Lord, should I go out to fight the Philistines? Will you hand them over to me? Well, the Lord replied to David, yes, go ahead. I will certainly hand them over to you. Now, David would have been in charge of the forces of Israel. He could have just barreled out there and barreled headlong and kind of used his strength and the strength of his army, but he didn't want to go into battle just with his own strength, his own power. He wanted God's permission. Because with God's permission, when God says, yeah, you go and I'll go with you, that's inherently a promise of God's presence, of God's power, and ultimately God's victory. So David went to Bel Perazim and defeated the Philistines there. Yay! The Lord did it, David exclaimed. He burst through my enemies like a raging flood. So David named that place Bel Perazim, which means the Lord who bursts through. Well, this is the spoiler I referenced earlier. This is the only time in the entire Bible we come across this phrase burst through, or some other translations translate it breakthrough. And it's used to describe God, that God is the Lord of the breakthrough. Victory, broke through, yay, drop the mic, we're done. Except for what happens next. Samuel records that after a while, the Philistines returned and again spread out across the valley of Rephaim. Same enemy, same place. So I feel like we should have an honest conversation. Have you ever felt like you're facing the same battle with the same enemy? You know, the same fears that you thought you'd defeated, the same marriage tensions you thought you'd overcome, the same rejection you thought you'd grown beyond, the same discouragement that you thought you'd kind of lifted yourself out of, and yet you find yourself facing the same enemy in the same place. But it's a different day. That's the thing that's different. So let's talk about that. David again asked the Lord what to do. Well, in this case, God said, don't attack them straight on. Okay. Instead, circle around behind and attack them near the poplar trees. Same enemy, same place, different day, different strategy. See, David, he could have just done what he did the last time because it kind of worked the last time. But the genius here when David asked God is that he recognized it was a different day. And he didn't want to fight the same enemy today with yesterday's plans. And the reason this is important is when we come against, in those times that we come against the same enemy in the same place, but it's a different day, chances are you're different. Chances are you've grown. Chances are you have a greater capacity. And when we go to God and say, what's the plan here? He might give us the same strategy that worked last time, but sometimes he might take advantage of the fact that we've grown, that we have a greater capacity, and he might actually point to something new, something more effective, something that's going to take us further than the plan last time. So God said, when you hear a sound like marching feet in the tops of the poplar trees, be on alert. That will be the signal that the Lord is moving ahead of you to strike down the Philistine army. Now, last week we discovered the great news that when the nation of Israel faced a physical wall and obstacle, that prior to even getting there, God was on the other side of that wall working on their behalf, and he does that. And we need to know that. Well, here again, we're reminded that we have a God who goes before us. He promises that he's moving ahead to strike down the enemy. So let me riff on a question that I asked last week. What difference would it make when you're once again facing a familiar enemy that you may think that you can't defeat, that there's no way forward, that there's no way out of it? What difference would it make knowing that God is already moving ahead to strike down that enemy? And not just to know it up here, but to actually be looking for it. And God said to David, look up on the tops of the trees. And here's a really key shift. Not an easy shift, but it's a key shift. See, one of the things that is true when we're facing hard times, when we're feeling overwhelmed, when we're feeling like we can't make a way out, is we can be so consumed with looking at the problem, looking down, that we forget to look up, to look to God, to see what he's doing, to see where he's moving. But we need to know that he's moving, and we need to muster up everything we can, and we need to surround ourselves with faith-filled people who are going to join us to try and look up and see what God's doing. And then when we see him moving, we do what he said to David, follow quickly. So David did what the Lord commanded, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Giza. So that's it, friends. That's a wrap on our 3-week series, God Can Make a Way. Go back and watch, go back and listen. Let's keep growing, knowing we serve a God for whom nothing is impossible.